Hey friend, Chris Vandeviver here from WhyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Today I want to show you how you can use Drum Kit Designer as a tool for doubling or replacing your existing drum tracks. While this is not specific to acoustic or live recorded drums, very often these are the types of drums that could use a little help from drum samples. First things first, I have a drum performance here that we're going to take a listen to, and it's live recorded drums. I've done some EQ, some compression. I've tried to rein in these drums the best I could. And I also have two instances of Drum Kit Designer supplementing both the kick drum and the snare. So let's take a listen to what I have here. Cool. And let's hear without these two samples in place. So let's mute them and take a listen. And let's go back and forth. So we'll take a listen and then I'll introduce the samples back into the mix. Cool. These samples are not loud in the mix. They're quite quiet. If you take a look at the mixer, you can see the kick drum is like -32. The snare is -12, quite low, but it adds a presence, it adds an air, and it adds a little more stability to the drum kit in a way that makes the kick and the snare feel a little better in the mix. We should even take a listen to where these drums started out at. So let's mute our samples, select all of the drum tracks in the track stack, and I'll bypass everything. So take a listen to where we started. So not too great. And then we add all the plugins. And we add the samples. All right, so much farther along than where we started at. Pretty boomy, pretty muddy. So how do we get to the point of using Drum Kit Designer as our samples? Let's take a look at the Drum Kit Designer instances that I have here. First, I've chosen the Studio Felt kick drum, and I've even included Room B in the mix. What's great about Drum Kit Designer is we're able to add either leak or the overhead sound of a particular drum, or even a room, either A, which tends to be in stereo, or B, which tends to be in mono. And I chose the more mono signal, so the kick drum's coming straight down the center. And if we take a look at the channel strip here, I've used the linear EQ to actually roll off quite a bit of the low end because this kick drum has no problem with low end. It's more like the top or sticky attack that I want to add. And then I've also used the Fat Effects to add a touch of distortion, quite a bit of compression just to stabilize it. And then with the snare sample, if we pop open, it's actually a full producer kit. If we open Drum Kit Designer, I've chosen, I believe, a muted brass, yep. And I haven't introduced any sort of overhead or room at all, but instead just a tiny bit of EQ to emphasize the body of the snare drum, and also just some compression to bring up some sustain. Okay, let's start pulling apart how you can get to this point with Drum Kit Designer. Drum replacement is not new to Logic. It's actually been around, I think, since Logic 9, maybe a little earlier, but I'm pretty sure it's 9. And it's very simple. You select the drum that you want to double or replace. So in this case, I'm going to pick the snare for now. We'll mute this one. And we go up to Track and go down to Replace or Double Drum Kit. You can also use the key command, Command D. When we click this, Logic is going to analyze the transients in the snare track. So it's going to look for everywhere there's a drum hit. Now this is very quick because I've already done this once before, but if we zoom in, we can see the snare track here, right? And then if we look down below, we have a sampler track where there's a MIDI note everywhere there's a snare drum hit. And we can even choose what kind of instrument we're intending to double or replace. And this is important because this will determine what kind of samples are offered to us by this facility. So we can choose from the drop-down instrument, snare, kick, tom, or other. And the trigger note adjusts based on the type of drum that we choose. So if I pick kick, it's going to be auto, but if we double-click and see here, the kick is on C1, as C1 tends to be the home of any kick drum sample for any drum instrument in Logic. Cool. And if we choose other, the MIDI notes are not just placed on C1 or where the snare tends to live or the toms. Instead, we get a whole drop down that we can choose from. And we can see we have slap at E0. If we take a look, C1 kick, you can choose the actual note where you prefer the MIDI notes to be placed, and you can do this for any of the other drums as well. We take a look. From there, we can also choose the mode, either replacement or doubling. Are you intending to completely replace this drum sound or double? I recommend doubling so you can hear the drum sound in relation to the original drum sound that you're planning on either doubling or replacing. And then we have the relative threshold. Right now, we can see that Logic has done a pretty good job of identifying where the snare drum hits are. It's not accidentally considering any bleed on the snare track as an actual snare hit. But just like a compressor or gate, we can adjust the threshold related to where MIDI notes are placed. So maybe Logic is having a hard time identifying the notes. Either Logic is identifying bleed as drum hits that you want, so you would close up the threshold, drag it closer to 0, and you can see that we're taking away notes now. And if I drag it further to the left, it's going to introduce more notes than we want. But the threshold allows you to tell Logic what's an actual hit that you care about and what is not. So we'll set this back to about -12. We can also preview our drum sound side by side with the snare drum. And you can see here in the library, there's a whole host of acoustic snare sounds that we can choose from. So let's preview. All right, they're pretty usable, but I find them to feel a little one-dimensional, and that's why I choose to go with Drum Kit Designer instead. From here, once you have the relative threshold set to where you need it, you've chosen your instrument, you've chosen doubling or replacement, and you feel like, cool, we've got the MIDI notes where we need them, then you just hit OK. And now Logic has created a new software instrument track using Sampler. But we're going to replace Sampler and go with Drum Kit Designer. And I believe that Drum Kit Designer is a lot more usable in the case of drum sampling. So let's open Drum Kit Designer, and let's just hear the snare in relation to the original snare. As you can see, we only have 3 snares to choose from, and I feel like that's just not going to be good enough. So let's go into Drum Kit, down to Producer Kits, and let's choose the Unmixed Kit. Great, now we have a track stack with all of the individual tracks, but really we're just concerned with the snare. Let's open the track stack, click on the overhead track, and now we can choose a new instance of Drum Kit Designer with all of the snares that we might want to use. Let's hear this side by side with the snare track. Great, so that's my muted brass. That's what I'm going to stick with. And we can even choose between having a leak, the overhead track, or even a room track. In this case, I just want to keep things dry, but this gives us further tonal shaping for our snare sample to blend into the mix. We also have the ability to adjust the velocity of the individual samples themselves. So we can see this is pretty quiet. The drummer, I guess, played the snare relatively quiet. But I want to bump this up to what I feel would be more usable in the mix. I don't want it too loud. I don't want it to be at full blast at 127 velocity, but I want something a little more assertive. So let's pick 68. Great, and then we can blend this to taste underneath our snare track. And we can even choose, do we want the snare bottom track, the top track? If we were working with the kick, do you want the kick in and out? Sometimes Drum Kit Designer includes like a parallel compression channel. Do you want to include that? There's so much tonal shaping available for this particular snare drum. And, even though I have the sample here, we can take a listen in relation to the rest of the mix here. And before and after with the snare in and out. And just like that, we can quickly double or replace our drum tracks. You have a whole variety of drums that you can choose and tune or dampen. And once again, Logic has just about all the tools we need to craft great songs and great mixes and masters. So I hope that was helpful for you. If it was, as always, I highly suggest subscribing to the YouTube channel, Why Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, whylogicprorules.com. Every week, I'm posting new videos, new emails, and posts to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Thanks so much.